Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we are going to Han Dynasty China. The Han, the dynasty that ruled China from 206 BCE to 220 CE, with a brief interruption in the middle for a total of approximately 4 centuries, was one of the most consequential civilizations in the history of the world. It established the Confucian bureaucratic system that would govern China for the next 2,000 years. It opened the Silk Road that connected China to Central Asia, Persia, Rome, and eventually the entire world. It produced the system of government examinations that made China's administration the most meritocratic in the ancient world. It gave the Chinese people their name, the Han Chinese, which they still use to describe themselves. It was, in the most literal sense, the foundation of everything that came after it in Chinese history. And before we begin, let me tell you the 3 things that will stay with you through this entire story. First, Empress Lü Zhi, the wife of the Han Dynasty's founder Liu Bang, did something so horrifying to her political rival that it was still being talked about in China 2,000 years later. Her rival was Lady Qi, her husband's favorite concubine and the mother of his preferred son. After Liu Bang died in 195 BCE and Lü Zhi became the Empress Dowager, she had Lady Qi's hands and feet cut off, her eyes gouged out, her ears burned, her voice destroyed with a drug, and the resulting living body, still alive, incapable of movement or communication, placed in a privy and called the human pig. She then brought her own son, the emperor, to see it as a lesson. The emperor, confronted with what his mother had done, reportedly said that only a non-human being could have done such a thing, and spent the rest of his reign in a state of traumatized incapacity from which he never recovered. Lü Zhi governed China for the next 15 years. The country ran well by most assessments during her governance. Both of these things are true simultaneously. This is the kind of fact that history asks you to hold without resolving. Second, Ban Zhao, born approximately 45 CE, died approximately 120 CE, was the most learned woman in the Han Dynasty and possibly in the history of the ancient world to that point. Her father Ban Biao had been a historian. Her brother Ban Gu had taken up the task of completing their father's history and was in the process of writing what would become the Book of Han, one of the 4 great official histories of Chinese civilization, when he was arrested during a political crisis and died in prison. The Book of Han was unfinished. Ban Zhao completed it. She was the primary author of the finished sections of one of China's most important historical works, and she did this while also serving as the imperial librarian, as the teacher of the empress and the consort ladies in the study of the classical texts, and as the author of her own works including the Nüjie, the Admonitions for Women, a text that specified how women should behave and that was used as a conduct guide for Chinese women for the next approximately 2,000 years. The woman who wrote one of China's great official histories also wrote the text that constrained women's lives for 2 millennia. The complexity of this is not a contradiction to be resolved. It is the actual situation. Third, the Silk Road, the network of trade routes that connected Han China to the rest of the ancient world, was not traveled exclusively by men. The caravans that moved silk and spices and glass and horses across the deserts and mountains of Central Asia included women among their members. The wives and daughters of merchants who traveled with the caravans, the women of the oasis settlements who managed the hospitality industry that the caravans required, the women who produced the silk that was the road's primary commodity, the women who wove and embroidered and processed the textiles that moved in both directions along the routes. The Silk Road was a world that women inhabited, managed, and sustained, and the popular image of it as a male adventure story leaves out most of the people who actually made it work. So go ahead and get comfortable. Lights down, blanket up. This one is slow and calm and going nowhere fast. And if you haven't subscribed yet, we're here every night, new story, same pace, lights always low. Let's begin. The Han Dynasty was founded by Liu Bang, a man of peasant origin who rose through the chaos of the Qin dynasty's collapse to become the first Han emperor, the Gaozu. His rise is one of the most remarkable social mobility stories in Chinese history. A village headman from the state of Chu who managed to defeat rivals of much higher social origin through a combination of military skill, political intelligence, and the specific capacity to attract and retain talented subordinates. His wife was Lü Zhi, a woman of slightly higher social origin than Liu Bang himself, the daughter of a local notable who had given his daughter in marriage to the promising young man. She was with him throughout the dangerous years of the Civil War, managing the household and the family while he fought, enduring hardships that the historical record documents with enough specificity to give us a sense of what the war years were like from a woman's perspective. She was at one point captured by the opposing forces and held for approximately 2 years as a hostage, a period that the historical record does not describe in detail, but that was certainly not comfortable and was probably genuinely dangerous. The Confucian system that the Han Dynasty adopted and formalized as its governing ideology was, in its formal treatment of gender, one of the most thoroughly articulated systems of female subordination in any civilization. The 3 obediences, a woman's obedience to her father, then her husband, then her son, organized women's lives around a sequence of male authorities. The 4 virtues, womanly virtue, womanly words, womanly bearing, and womanly work, specified the qualities that a properly Confucian woman was supposed to cultivate. The distinction between the inner sphere, women's domain, and the outer sphere, men's domain, was the foundational organizational principle of the Confucian gender order. And yet the Han Dynasty's actual history is full of women who exercised significant political power, who produced significant intellectual work, who engaged with the world outside the inner sphere in ways that the formal ideology did not prescribe and sometimes explicitly prohibited. The gap between the ideology and the practice is one of the most interesting features of Han Dynasty women's history, and it is the gap we are going to be spending our time in tonight. Let's begin with the mourning. The mourning of a Han Dynasty woman in the 2nd century BCE, the early Han period, the years after the dynasty's founding when the institutions that would govern the civilization for 4 centuries were being established. Before dawn in Han China, the mourning that sustained the empire. The Han Dynasty city, Chang'an, the capital, or one of the secondary cities of the empire, woke to a mourning organized around the specific requirements of Chinese urban life. The drum tower that stood at the center of major Han cities beat the hours through the night and morning, organizing the city's time in a way that was audible throughout the urban space. The dawn drum announced the city's opening, the gates of the walled residential wards, the gates of the markets, and the day officially began. The household of a moderately prosperous Han family, not the aristocracy, not the peasant, but the class of the literate administrators and the successful merchants who were the backbone of the Han social structure, woke with the drum. The fire had to be started for the morning meal. The fire in the Han kitchen was managed in the specific clay stove, the Zhao, that was the central cooking apparatus of the Chinese household, and the management of the fire required starting it from coals banked through the night and feeding it with wood in the sequence that the morning's cooking required. The morning meal in the Han household was organized around the staples of the Chinese diet: millet in the north, rice in the south, and the various preparations of these grains that constituted the foundation of the daily diet. The congee, the rice or millet porridge that was the most common morning food, was prepared in the ceramic pot over the Zhao, and its preparation required the management of the water-to-grain ratio and the cooking time that produced the right consistency. The accompaniments, pickled vegetables, dried fish, bean preparations, were prepared or retrieved from storage and arranged for the morning meal. The textile production that was one of the primary economic activities of the Han household was, as in every agricultural civilization we have discussed, primarily women's work. Silk was the primary luxury textile of Han China, and its production, the raising of silkworms on mulberry leaves, the management of the cocoons, the reeling of the thread, the weaving of the fabric on the loom, was a sequential production process that was managed in the household and that required the specific knowledge of each stage. The silk loom of the Han period was a sophisticated piece of equipment. The draw loom that was developed in China during the Han period could produce the complex silk weaving patterns that characterized Han silk textiles, and operating it required both physical skill and the specific pattern knowledge that the weaver had to maintain in memory or in some form of notation. The women who operated the draw loom were skilled technicians operating sophisticated equipment, and the luxury silk textiles they produced were among the most valued commodities in the ancient world. The specific silk textiles of the Han period that have survived, preserved in the specific conditions of Han burial sites that the archaeology of the 20th century has uncovered, give us an extraordinary picture of the quality and the sophistication of Han silk production. The Mwangdui tombs, excavated in Hunan province in the 1970s and 1980s, contain silk textiles of extraordinary preservation and extraordinary quality. Gauze so fine that it has been described as the finest textile the ancient world produced, embroidered silks of complex patterns, plain silks in a range of colors. These textiles were the products of women's labor, and the quality they represent, the thousands of hours of work that produced a single piece of fine gauze, is a direct measure of what the Han silk industry's female workers were producing. The management of the household's finances was another dimension of the Han woman's daily responsibilities. The Han economy was a monetized economy. The iron coins of the Han imperial mint circulated throughout the empire and were the primary medium of commercial transaction. The household's economic management required the tracking of income and expenditure in the specific currency of the Han monetary system, and the women who managed the household's accounts were performing real financial management. The Han period produced a significant body of household management literature, texts that specified how a proper household should be organized, what the proper conduct of the household manager was, how the various tasks of domestic life should be allocated and supervised. This literature was addressed to the women who managed the household, and its existence tells us something about the expectations of the Han educated class regarding women's household management capabilities. They expected real management competence, which is why they produced literature to guide it. Empress Lü Zhi, the power behind and the power itself. Let's spend the time that Empress Lü Zhi deserves, because she is one of the most consequential and most complex figures in the history of the Han Dynasty, and the specific combination of her political effectiveness and her political ruthlessness makes her one of the most interesting women in Chinese history. She was born around 241 BCE into the family of Lu Wan, a local notable who recognized something in the young Liu Bang and gave his daughter to him in marriage. The early years of her marriage were spent in the village conditions of Liu Bang's original milieu. Not comfortable, not aristocratic, but the practical domestic life of a capable woman managing a household with limited resources. She had 2 children by Liu Bang, a son, Liu Ying, and a daughter who would become the Princess Yuan of Lu. When Liu Bang joined the rebellion against the Qin dynasty in the late 210s BCE, Lü Zhi was left behind with the children while he campaigned. The chaos of the late Qin period was dangerous for everyone, and the specific danger of being the family of a rebel commander was real. She managed the household and the children through years of instability with the practical intelligence that the sources consistently attribute to her. Her capture by the forces of Xiongnu, Liu Bang's primary rival in the Civil War, and her holding as a hostage for approximately 2 years is one of the episodes in her life that the historical record documents but does not fully illuminate. She was released when Liu Bang and Xiongnu concluded a temporary truce, and she returned to Liu Bang's household, where she found that his relationship with Lady Qi, a concubine he had taken during the years of the war, had become significant enough that Lady Qi's son was being discussed as a possible heir. This is the background to the events after Liu Bang's death. The question of the succession, whether Liu Bang's son by Lü Zhi or his son by Lady Qi would inherit the throne, was the central political question of Liu Bang's final years, and it was a question in which Lü Zhi had an obvious and enormous stake. Liu Bang died in 195 BCE. Liu Ying, Lü Zhi's son, became the Emperor Hui. Lü Zhi became the Empress Dowager, the most powerful woman in the empire. And then she did what she did to Lady Qi. The incident is recorded in the Shiji, the records of the Grand Historian, the great historical work of Sima Qian that is the primary source for the early Han period, with a specificity that makes it one of the most disturbing passages in classical Chinese historical writing. Sima Qian describes the mutilation in clinical detail, describes the Emperor Hui's response, and describes the effect on the emperor's subsequent reign. He is not celebrating what Lü Zhi did, but he is recording it with the specific detail that he recorded other significant historical events, which tells you something about how he understood its significance. The Emperor Hui's response, his statement that only a non-human being could have done this, and his subsequent inability to govern effectively are presented in the Shiji as the direct consequence of his mother's action. He was traumatized. He spent his remaining years in a state of psychological withdrawal from the demands of rule, drinking and seeking distractions, dying in 188 BCE at the age of 22. He had seen something that broke something in him, and Sima Qian records this as a straightforward human response to a genuinely inhumane event. After Hui's death, Lü Zhi governed China as regent, first through a child emperor who was her grandson, then through another who was the son of Liu Bang by another woman but whom she controlled completely. She ruled in her own name for approximately 15 years, from 188 BCE to 180 BCE, and during this period she governed the empire with a competence that the sources, even those hostile to her, acknowledge. The specific policies of her regency included the maintenance of the Huanglao philosophy, the blend of Taoist and legalist thought that had guided the early Han's governing approach of light governance, low taxes, and recovery from the Qin dynasty's exhausting legalism, that had produced a period of genuine economic recovery in the empire's first decades. She maintained diplomatic relations with the Xiongnu, the steppe nomads to the north who were the Han Dynasty's primary military challenge, through the marriage alliance system, Haqin, that Liu Bang had established, which required regular payments and marriages of Han princesses to Xiongnu leaders. She expanded the commercial activities that the early Han's relatively liberal economic policies had encouraged. The Han Dynasty's official historians, writing after the Liu family's fall from power, in the reign of Emperor Wen who came to the throne after Lü Zhi's death, treated her regency as a usurpation, as a violation of the proper order in which imperial authority belonged to the Lü family. The specific historical framework that the official histories applied to her governance was one of condemnation, emphasizing the illegitimacy of her power and the horror of her treatment of Lady Qi. But the historical reality that the same sources inadvertently preserve is of a woman who governed effectively, who maintained the empire's stability, who made reasonable policy decisions, and who protected the Lü family's dynasty, including her own son's position as emperor, through the ruthless elimination of threats. The specific contradiction between the quality of the governance and the horror of Lady Qi's fate is the thing that makes Lü Zhi so difficult to assess in simple moral terms, and that makes her such a vivid and such a disturbing figure in the Han historical tradition. She died in 180 BCE. After her death, the Lü family regrouped and eliminated the Lü family from positions of power in what the historical sources describe as the restoration of proper order. Lady Qi's fate is remembered in the Chinese historical tradition as one of the most extreme examples of palace cruelty. Lü Zhi's governance is remembered as one of the most effective examples of female regency in Chinese history. Both memories belong to the same person, and the tradition has never found a way to reconcile them that does not do violence to one or the other. The daily life of the palace women, the inner court of Han China. Let's spend some time inside the inner court of the Han imperial palace, the harem, in the general sense of the word, the residential and administrative space of the imperial family's women. Because the inner court of the Han Dynasty was a significant institution with its own hierarchy, its own administrative structure, and its own daily life that was both enclosed and consequential. The Han imperial inner court was organized in a specific hierarchy. At the top was the Empress, the Huangho, the primary consort of the emperor, the woman whose son would be the designated heir if she bore one. Below her were the various ranks of imperial consorts, organized in a hierarchy of titles that the Han government specified with administrative precision: the Jiu, the Meiren, the Liangdi, the Bashi, the Changshi. Each rank had its specific allocation of quarters, servants, and income. The competition for the emperor's favor that these ranks represented was the organizing dynamic of the inner court's social world. The Empress Dowager, the dowager consort of the previous emperor, typically the reigning emperor's mother, occupied a position above the current empress in terms of formal protocol and sometimes in terms of actual political power. The specific power of the Empress Dowager was one of the most significant forms of female political authority available in the Han system, and several Empress Dowagers, Lü Zhi being the most prominent but not the only one, exercised this authority in ways that shaped the dynasty's political history substantially. The daily life of the imperial consorts was organized around the specific requirements of the inner court's institutional structure. Morning rituals, the specific Confucian ceremonies of greeting, of paying respect to the empress and the empress dowager, of maintaining the proper relationships among the members of the court hierarchy, organized the beginning of the day with the precision of a system that understood correct social form as a moral requirement rather than a mere courtesy. The education of the inner court's women was a specific institutional concern. The Han court maintained a system of female scholars, the Nüjie, the women historians or women secretaries, who provided instruction in the classical texts to the empress and the consorts. The expectation that imperial consorts would be educated in the Confucian classics, in the poetry, the ritual texts, the historical works that formed the basis of the educated person's knowledge, was a Han court institution that produced some of the most learned women in Chinese history. Ban Zhao, whom we will discuss at length, served in this capacity as the teacher of the empress and the consort ladies in the classical texts. during the reign of Emperor He 88 to 105 CE. Her presence in this role as the court's primary female scholar was not exceptional in the context of the Han inner court's intellectual culture. It was the specific form that the Han court's provision for women's education took, and the women who were educated in it were receiving instruction in the same textual tradition that the male court officials were educated in through the imperial examinations. The textile production of the inner court was a significant enterprise. The imperial workshops produced the silk and other textiles required for the court's own use, the ceremonial garments, the gifts of fabric that were a primary form of imperial patronage, the textiles used in religious and ritual ceremonies. The women of the inner court were involved in this production, both directly in the weaving workshops and in the supervisory management of the workshop operations. The specific crafts of the inner court, the embroidery, the painting of lacquerware, the production of the various luxury objects that characterized the Han court's material culture, were women's work in the sense that the inner court's women were the primary practitioners of these arts in the court context. The quality of these objects, preserved in the Han burial sites that archaeology has uncovered, is evidence of the skill level that the inner court's production achieved. Ban Zhao, the woman who wrote history and its constraints. Let's spend the extended time that Ban Zhao deserves, because Ban Zhao is one of the most significant intellectual figures in the history of Chinese civilization and the specific complexity of her legacy. The woman who completed China's official history and also wrote the text that constrained women's lives for 2,000 years is one of the most interesting intellectual stories in the ancient world. She was born around 45 CE in Fufeng, in what is now Shaanxi province. Her family was the most distinguished scholarly family in Han China. Her father Ban Biao had been a historian who had begun the project of writing a history of the Western Han Dynasty, the first period of the Han before the brief interruption of the Xi Dynasty. Her brother Ban Gu had taken up the project after their father's death and had been working on what would become the Han Shu, the Book of Han, for years when he was arrested during a political crisis following the death of the general Dou Xian, to whose household he had been attached, and died in prison in 92 CE. The Han Shu was unfinished at Ban Gu's death. The sections that remained incomplete were the astronomical tables and the treatise on geography, technically demanding sections that required specific scholarly knowledge. The imperial court recognized that the project needed to be completed and appointed Ban Zhao to finish it. She completed the unfinished sections. The Han Shu was presented to the emperor in its finished form. It is now one of the 4 great official histories of Chinese civilization, taught and studied for 2,000 years. Ban Zhao's sections are part of it. The specific scholarly demands that the completion of the Han Shu required tell us something about Ban Zhao's intellectual capabilities. The astronomical tables, the records of celestial events organized in the calendar system, required precise technical knowledge of the astronomical tradition and of the mathematical systems used to track celestial movements. The geographical treatise required comprehensive knowledge of the administrative geography of the Han Empire and of the sources that documented it. These were not light scholarly tasks. They were demanding technical projects, and Ban Zhao completed them to the standard that allowed the work to be accepted as the continuation of her father's and brother's project. She was also the imperial librarian, the person responsible for the collection and organization of the texts in the imperial library, which was one of the largest collections of texts in the ancient world. The management of this collection required comprehensive knowledge of the textual tradition, of what existed, in what form, in what state of preservation, with what relationship to other texts and other versions. The person who managed the imperial library was, in effect, the custodian of the civilization's written heritage, and the Han court trusted this role to Ban Zhao. Her teaching role in the inner court, as the instructor of the Empress and the consorts in the classical texts, placed her at the center of the Han court's intellectual life in a different way. She was not simply a scholar in isolation. She was the teacher of the most powerful women in the empire, the person who shaped the intellectual formation of the women who occupied the most politically significant positions in the Han Dynasty's institutional structure. And then there is the Nüjie, the Admonitions for women. This is the text that makes Ban Zhao's legacy complicated in the specific way that matters. The Nüjie was composed, according to Ban Zhao's own account, for the instruction of her daughters before their marriages. She was aware, she wrote, that her daughters would enter their husbands' households without having received the full education that the proper conduct of a married woman required, and she was writing to supply this deficiency. The text specifies the behavior of the properly Confucian wife: humility, submission to the husband's authority, careful management of the husband's household, avoidance of the jealousy that the presence of multiple wives and concubines would inevitably occasion, deference to the parents-in-law. The text is in some respects a perfectly conventional expression of the Confucian gender ideology of its period. The 3 obediences and the 4 virtues are here, expressed with the clarity of a scholar who understood the system thoroughly. The prescription of female humility and submission is consistent with the mainstream of Han Confucian thought on gender. But the Nüjie has some features that distinguish it from simple conformism. Ban Zhao argues that women should be educated, that the failure to educate daughters is a failure to prepare them for the role that the society assigns them. She notes, with a directness that is remarkable for the period, that the mutual obligations of the marital relationship run in both directions, that while wives owe their husbands respect and deference, husbands owe their wives fair treatment and consideration. She is not arguing for gender equality in any modern sense, but she is arguing, within the framework of the Confucian system, for a conception of the marital relationship that is less purely unilateral than the formal ideology sometimes implied. The influence of the Nüjie on subsequent Chinese women's lives was enormous. The text was copied and reprinted and incorporated into collections of texts for women's education across the following 2,000 years. It shaped the curriculum of women's education in China from the Han Dynasty through the Qing. The specific model of female virtue that it described became the standard against which Chinese women were evaluated by themselves and by others across 20 centuries. This is a fact that is difficult to hold without some complexity. The most learned woman in the Han Dynasty, the woman who completed an official history, who managed the imperial library, who taught the classical tradition to the empire's most powerful women, produced, as one of her contributions to Chinese civilization, the text that constrained women's intellectual and social lives for the next 2,000 years. She wrote the guide to female submission from within the position of one of the most intellectually emancipated women of her age. Whether Ban Zhao herself saw the tension in this is something we cannot know with certainty. The Nüjie was addressed to her daughters, written in the practical spirit of preparing them for the world as it was rather than as it might be different. The world she was preparing them for was the Confucian world of the Han Dynasty, and the Nüjie was a practical guide to navigating that world successfully. That the world itself imposed constraints on women that Ban Zhao's own life partially transcended, through the specific accidents of her family's scholarly tradition and the imperial court's need for her particular knowledge, is the tension that the text does not address directly. The scholars who have written about Ban Zhao in recent decades have approached this tension in various ways. Some have emphasized the progressive elements of the Nüjie, the argument for women's education, the bilateral conception of the marital relationship. Some have emphasized the conservative elements, the prescription of submission, the confirmation of the three obediences. Most have ended up acknowledging that the tension is real and not easily resolved, that Zhao was a person of genuine intellectual distinction who operated within and partly reinforced the constraints that her civilization placed on women, and that both of these things are true simultaneously. The Silk Road women, the workers, the travelers, the oasis managers. Let's go to the Silk Road. Because the Silk Road, the network of trade routes that connected Han China to the rest of the ancient world, was one of the most significant developments in world history, and the women who were part of it have been almost entirely absent from the popular account of it. The Silk Road is typically imagined as a story of male merchants and male diplomats and male soldiers making their way across the deserts and mountains of Central Asia with caravans of camels and silk. This is not entirely wrong. The merchants who organized the long-distance caravans and managed the commercial transactions were predominantly male. The diplomats who negotiated the political relationships that made the trade possible were predominantly male. The soldiers who provided the military protection that the trade required were exclusively male. But the road was not a world of men alone. The women who were part of it occupied specific positions in the road's economic and social ecosystem, and their presence was not incidental or marginal. It was structural. The specific forms of their participation were necessary to the road's functioning in ways that the male-centered account tends to make invisible. The silk that gave the Silk Road its name was produced by women. The raising of silkworms, the sericultural process that produced the raw material for the luxury textile that was China's primary export, was women's work in the Han economy, organized in the household and in the large imperial and aristocratic workshops, and managed by women at every stage from the hatching of the silkworm eggs to the reeling of the cocoons. Without women's labor, there was no silk. Without silk, there was no Silk Road in any meaningful sense. The weaving of the silk into the complex luxury textiles that the Western markets valued, the woven patterns, the embroidered designs, the specific surface treatments that characterized Han silk, was also women's work. The weavers who produced the luxury silk textiles that traveled to Parthia and Rome and beyond were women operating sophisticated looms with specific technical skills that were transmitted through the female production networks of the Han economy. The women who traveled with the caravans along the road itself were primarily the wives and daughters of the merchants who organized the trade. The long-distance caravans that moved goods across the thousands of kilometers between Chang'an and Antioch were not exclusively male enterprises. They were household enterprises, and households included women. The merchant's wife who traveled with the caravan was managing the household's accounts, overseeing the goods that were the household's commercial stock, managing the logistical requirements of the caravan's movement through the various political territories it crossed. The specific conditions of caravan travel were not comfortable for anyone, and the specific vulnerabilities of women travelers, the dangers of the road, the specific social vulnerabilities of women in transit through territories organized around male authority were real. But the documentary record of the Silk Road, which includes the vast archive of documents found at the Central Asian oasis sites, Dunhuang, Turfan, Khotan, includes references to women's presence in the commercial world of the road with enough consistency to establish that it was normal rather than exceptional. The oasis towns that provided the staging points for the Silk Road's traffic, the places where caravans rested, traded, reprovisioned, and waited out the seasons, were communities that required the full range of human services, and women provided many of them. the hospitality industry of the oasis towns, the inns and the food services and the various commercial establishments that served the caravan traffic, employed women in the various roles that the hospitality industry requires. The management of the inn that housed the caravan, the management of the food production, the management of the sleeping arrangements, the management of the commercial transactions that the inn services required, was women's work in the specific oasis economies of Central Asia. The textile production of the oasis towns was another significant form of women's economic participation in the Silk Road economy. The oasis towns were producers of textiles as well as transit points for them. The specific textile traditions of Central Asian oasis communities, mixing Chinese and Western techniques and designs in the specific hybrid tradition of the Silk Road cultural zone, were produced by women weavers in the oasis households and workshops. The textiles that have been found at Dunhuang and Turfan include examples of this hybrid production, the product of women's labor in the specific multicultural environment of the Silk Road's central corridor. The Haqin princesses, the Han imperial princesses who were given in marriage to the leaders of the Xiongnu and other steppe peoples as part of the diplomatic arrangements that maintained the Han Dynasty's northern border, are a specific category of women whose experience of the Silk Road was the most dramatic and the most thoroughly documented. These women were not slaves and they were not volunteers. They were diplomatic instruments, given by the Han court to maintain the peace that protected the Silk Road's western approaches. The most famous of the Haqin princesses whose story has survived in some detail is Wang Zhaojun, one of the imperial concubines who was given to the Xiongnu Chanyu Huhanyi in 33 BCE as part of a peace settlement. The story of Wang Zhaojun, the beautiful concubine who was sent to live among the northern nomads, who bore the Chanyu's children, who adapted to the life of the steppe, who apparently became genuinely integrated into Xiongnu society, has been told in Chinese literature from the Han Dynasty to the present day, and it has accumulated layers of interpretation that make recovering the historical person difficult. What the historical record preserves is this: she was a woman who left the Han imperial inner court and traveled north to the steppe, who lived among the Xiongnu for the rest of her life, who bore children who became significant figures in Xiongnu political life, and who maintained the specific form of connection between the Han and Xiongnu worlds that the Haqin system created. Whether she was happy is something we cannot know. Whether she was miserable is also something we cannot know. What we can know is that she adapted, that she lived a life in a world she had not chosen and built something within it, which is the most human response to the most constraining circumstances. Empress Chun Ajiao, Love, Obsession, and the Gold Room. Let's talk about a different kind of Han imperial woman, not the politically powerful regent or the scholarly historian, but the woman whose story is primarily about the specific vulnerabilities of love and rivalry in the Han inner court. Chun Ajiao was the daughter of Lu Piao, Princess of Guantao, who was the aunt of the future Emperor Wu. The Princess of Guantao was a politically astute woman who saw in the young Lu Che, who would become Emperor Wu, the most capable and most ambitious of the Han emperors, a future that she wanted her family to benefit from. She arranged the betrothal of her daughter Chun Ajiao to Lu Che, and according to the tradition that has attached itself to this story, the young Lu Che said to his aunt, "If I could have Ajiao as my wife, I would build a golden room to keep her in." Whether he actually said this is probably legendary, it has the quality of the beautiful detail that accumulates around stories over time. But the phrase, the golden room, the specific promise of absolute preservation in perfect luxury, has been remembered in Chinese literature and idiom for 2,000 years, and it captures something real about the relationship between the young Lu Che and Chun Ajiao, which was genuinely significant to him at its beginning. Chen Ajiao became the empress when Lü Zhi became Emperor Wu in 141 BCE. She was the daughter of the woman who had arranged his rise to power, and her position was connected to her mother's political influence in a way that made the relationship between the emperor and his mother-in-law as politically significant as the relationship between the emperor and his wife. The specific problem that the Han inner court structure made essentially inevitable was children. Chen Ajiao did not produce a son. The years passed, the emperor's attention was claimed by other women. The political influence of the Princess of Guantao was not enough to compensate for the specific failure to produce an heir. Chen Ajiao reportedly became desperate in her attempts to produce a pregnancy. The sources mention her spending enormous sums on medical consultations and treatments, a detail that the historians record with a specificity that tells you something about how visible and how discussed her situation was at court. Then she was accused of practicing witchcraft, specifically of practicing the type of magic called gu, against the emperor's other favorite women. The investigation that followed resulted in the execution of 300 people and the deposition of Chen Ajiao, who was sent to live in the Chongmen Palace, a secondary palace outside the main court. She was given a significant income. The Golden Room promise translated into material provision rather than actual gold, but she was removed from the center of the imperial world. Sima Xiangru, one of the greatest poets of the Han Dynasty, was reportedly hired by Chen Ajiao to write a poem that would move the emperor to recall her. The result? The Chongmen Fu, the Rhapsody of the Long Gate, is one of the most celebrated pieces of Han literature. A lyrical poem in the voice of the abandoned empress waiting in the cold palace for a return that does not come. Whether the poem actually moved the emperor to recall her is debated. Whether Sima Xiangru actually wrote it for payment from Chen Ajiao is debated. What is not debated is that the poem exists and that it is a remarkable piece of literature. A woman's voice rendered by a man's pen, expressing the specific grief of waiting in an empty palace for a love that has moved on. Chen Ajiao died in the Chongmen Palace, alone in the sense that matters, without the man whose attention had defined her position and her identity in the Han court's world. Her story is one of the most completely documented individual tragedies in Han Dynasty women's history, and it illuminates something specific about the vulnerability of women whose position depended entirely on a man's personal favor rather than on any independent source of power. The contrast between Chen Ajiao's fate and Lü Zhi's is illuminating. Both were women in the Han imperial household. Both had their positions tied to the political dynamics of the court. But Lü Zhi's power, once established, had a political base: the management of the state apparatus, the control of appointments, the management of the court's military resources, that did not depend on personal favor from a man. Chen Ajiao's power was always only the emperor's affection, and when the affection transferred to another woman, everything went with it. The Woman Scholar's Day, education, library, and teaching. Let's reconstruct what Ban Zhao's daily life might have looked like in her years of active scholarship and teaching, because the specific daily texture of a female scholar's life in the Han Dynasty is worth understanding in detail. The Imperial Library, the repository of the Han court's collected texts, was a physical space within the Imperial Palace complex, a set of rooms where scrolls were stored, cataloged, and made available for scholarly use. The management of this collection required a system: the identification of texts, the organization of categories, the maintenance of the physical objects, and the assessment of the collection's completeness and the identification of missing texts that the library should acquire. Ban Zhao's work as the imperial librarian required regular engagement with this collection. the physical handling of the scrolls, the assessment of their condition, the organization of their arrangement. The Han scroll, the standard form of the text in this period, was a roll of silk or paper on which the text was written in vertical columns of characters, rolled on a wooden or bamboo rod. The management of a collection of thousands of these scrolls in a way that made specific texts retrievable required a system of organization that Zhao presumably developed and maintained. The teaching of the Empress and the consorts was a different kind of work. The social and pedagogical engagement of explaining classical texts to students who had the cultural formation of the inner court but not necessarily the sustained scholarly training that the classical texts required for full understanding. The 4 books and the 5 classics of the Confucian canon, the texts that formed the basis of the Han-educated person's intellectual formation, were the primary material of this teaching, and the ability to explain their content, to illuminate their difficulties, to connect them to the students' lived experiences, required both scholarly command and pedagogical skill. The specific classroom context of the inner court was unusual in ways that the general pedagogical literature does not describe. The teacher was a woman teaching other women in the secluded world of the imperial inner quarters, using the classical texts that had been developed primarily by and for men to provide women with a cultural formation that the court valued for its own specific reasons. The management of this teaching, choosing what to emphasize, deciding how to frame the text's relevance to the students' lives, navigating the specific political dynamics of teaching powerful women who might have their own opinions about the content, required the particular intelligence of the experienced teacher. Her own writing was presumably done in the private hours, the early morning before the court's demands began, the evening after the teaching was done. The scholarly writing that the completion of the Hanshu required, the specific research into astronomical records and geographical sources, the composition of the prose that connected the data, the management of the citation and documentation that official history required, was sustained intellectual work that had to be fitted into the margins of the institutional responsibilities. The composition of the Nüjie was a different kind of writing from the historical and scholarly work. It was addressed to a specific audience, her daughters, and written in the more personal register of the private letter rather than the formal register of official history. The shift between the modes of writing that her career required, the formal documentation of the Hanshu, the explanatory teaching of the classical texts, the personal instruction of the Nüjie, is evidence of the range of her intellectual capabilities and the range of her professional responsibilities. The farm women of Han China, the majority whose labor was the foundation. Let's spend some time with the women who were the actual majority of Han China's female population, the farm women of the countryside whose daily labor produced the agricultural surplus that sustained the empire's urban and court life. The Han agricultural system was organized around the small household farm, the jia, that was the basic economic unit of the Han rural economy. The household farm was worked by the family's own labor, supplemented by the labor of occasional hired workers at the peak agricultural seasons. The Confucian ideology that the Han government promoted celebrated the small independent farmer as the foundation of the social order, the hard-working, tax-paying farmer who cultivated the land and produced the grain that sustained the civilization. Women's labor in the Han farm household was not supplementary or marginal. It was essential. The specific tasks that were understood as women's work in the Han agricultural tradition included the textile production, the raising of silkworms, the management of the hemp cultivation, the spinning and weaving, and the management of the kitchen garden that produced the vegetables and herbs that supplemented the family's diet. These were productive activities that contributed directly to the household's economic output and survival. The specific expectation that Han women would be productive in both the agricultural and the textile domains, the standard formulation being that men plow and women weave, was so deeply embedded in the Han understanding of proper household organization that it was used as a metaphor for the basic division of the social order. The weaving woman was not a decorative figure in Han culture. She was a producer of economic value, and the Han state's taxation system acknowledged this by taxing cloth as well as grain. The textile production of the household was a recognized source of economic value that the state extracted alongside the agricultural surplus. The specific silk production that characterized the Han economy was not confined to the great aristocratic and imperial workshops. Ordinary farm households in the silk-producing regions of China, primarily the Yellow River Valley and parts of the Yangtze Valley, raised silkworms as part of their agricultural operations, and the silk they produced was both consumed in the household and contributed to the commodity market and the tax system. The farm woman who managed the silkworm trays, who fed the worms mulberry leaves on the precise schedule the cocoons required, who oversaw the boiling of the cocoons and the reeling of the thread, this woman was contributing to the Han economy's most important export industry through the specific labor of her daily management. The seasonal rhythm of the Han farm woman's year was organized around the overlap of the agricultural and the textile production cycles. The spring was the planting season, the preparation of the fields, the planting of the grain, the beginning of the silkworm season. The summer was the growing season, the management of the growing crops, the intensive silk production period. The autumn was the harvest season, the cutting and processing of the grain, the cotton or hemp harvest. The winter was the textile production season, the weaving of the cloth from the fibers produced in the previous seasons, the preparation for the next agricultural year. The social life of the Han farm woman was the village, the community of farming households that shared the agricultural landscape and cooperated in the various collective activities that village life required. The well, the communal threshing floor, the local temple. These were the social spaces of the Han rural community, and the women who gathered at them were maintaining the social relationships that made the community's mutual support possible. The religious life of the Han farm woman was organized around the popular religion of the Han period, the worship of the household gods, the local earth gods, the specific deities of the agricultural calendar whose favor was sought for rain and good harvest, the management of the household's religious observances, the preparation of the offerings, the maintenance of the household altar, the organization of the household's participation in the local temple festivals, was women's work in the Han household, and the women who performed these functions were performing the religious labor that maintained the household's relationship with the divine forces that the Han worldview understood as relevant to its welfare. Lady Wu, the historian's account, and the woman behind it. Let's talk about Lady Wu. Not the Tang Dynasty Empress Lü Zhi, who lived several centuries later, but the Lady Wu of the Han Dynasty, the grandmother of Emperor Wu, who navigated the early Han court's politics with a skill that the historical record preserves in the specific way that women's political activities tend to be preserved, in the context of the men whose careers she shaped. Lady Bo, the grandmother of Emperor Wu on his mother's side, was the concubine of Emperor Gaozu Liu Bang, who survived the purge of the Liu family after Empress Lü Zhi's death in 180 BCE. Her survival was partly a matter of being less politically prominent than the Liu family women who were targeted, and partly a matter of the specific political intelligence she had developed in the years of court life. Her son became Emperor Wan, the emperor who consolidated the Han Dynasty's institutional foundations after the disruption of the Liu Regency, and she became the Empress Dowager in his reign. The reign of Emperor Wan 180 to 157 BCE is celebrated in the Chinese historical tradition as one of the most successful and benevolent of the Han Dynasty's reigns. The Huanglao policies of light governance and economic recovery that the early Han had pursued were continued and extended. The population recovered from the devastation of the Qin-Han Civil War. Agricultural production increased. The empire's finances stabilized. The historians who describe this reign consistently attribute its success to the emperor's personal virtue and his wise choice of advisors. Lady Bo's influence on the character of the reign is not explicitly attributed in the historical accounts, which describe her primarily as a woman of dignified bearing who maintained the proper formalities of court life. But the specific values that characterized Emperor Wen's reign, the modesty, the economy, the preference for gentle governance over harsh legalism, are consistent with the influence of a woman who had survived the brutalities of the Lü Regency by being the opposite of brutally prominent, and who had reasons both personal and practical to value the kind of governance that did not create the conditions for the kind of violence she had witnessed. The specific women who shaped the reigns of individual Han emperors through the influence of proximity, as mothers, wives, and advisors, are present in the historical record in the way that women's influence is typically present, through the outcomes they produced rather than through the direct documentation of their specific contributions. The historians who wrote the Han Shu and the Shiji were documenting the actions of emperors and officials, and the women in the background of those actions appear primarily as context rather than as actors. Ban Zhao, as the author of sections of the Han Shu, was in the specific position of writing the history of a dynasty whose women she partially belonged to as a woman of the Han court, as the teacher of its consorts, as a participant in its intellectual life. Whether she shaped the historical accounts of women's roles in the Han Dynasty in specific ways, whether her authorship of specific sections of the Han Shu influenced how those sections treated women, is something that the scholars who work with the text have not been able to establish definitively. But that is not an unreasonable inference given the general principle that the person writing the history shapes what the history sees. Path women of Han popular religion, deities, shrines, and the female sacred. The official religion of the Han Dynasty. The state Confucian ritual system with its elaborate ceremonies, its specific calendar of sacrifices, its management by specialized officials, was primarily a male institution. The sacrifices at the great altars, the ceremonies at the imperial ancestral shrine, the management of the state's relationship with heaven that was the emperor's primary religious function, these were performed by men. But the religious life of ordinary Han people was not exhausted by the official religion, and women's participation in the popular religious world of the Han period was substantial and significant. The household gods, the Zhao Jun, the stove god, and the various other deities who were understood as present in and protective of the household space, were primarily managed by women. The specific rituals that maintained the household's relationship with its gods, the offerings at the stove, the management of the household altar, the observance of the specific taboos that the household deities required, were women's work in the Han household, and the women who performed them were performing a form of religious labor that the household depended on. The specific female deities of the Han popular pantheon, the Queen Mother of the West, Shi Wangmu, was the most significant, were figures of genuine religious importance whose worship was widespread in Han China. Shi Wangmu, the Queen Mother of the West, the ruler of the Jade Mountain Paradise in the far west, was not simply a female figure in a male-dominated pantheon. She was a deity of primary importance, the ruler of immortality, the possessor of the peaches of immortal life, the divine figure who received the great emperors of the past at her mountain palace. Her cult attracted both male and female devotees, but she was a specifically female divine power, and her significance in the Han religious world is evidence of the real presence of female divine authority in the tradition. The shamanic practices that persisted in Han China alongside the official Confucian religion were partly female-managed. The Wu, the spirit mediums who communicated with the divine world through transpossession, included both men and women, but women were particularly associated with certain forms of shamanic practice, particularly those connected with the management of illness and death. The specific function of the female shaman in managing the transition between life and death, the communication with the ancestors, the interpretation of illness as a spiritual condition, placed women at the center of some of the most emotionally significant religious moments in Han social life. The Buddhist tradition that was beginning to enter China during the Han period, Buddhism arrived in China approximately in the 1st century CE, at the very end of the Han Dynasty's history, included from its beginning a specific provision for women's religious practice in the form of the bhikkhuni, the female monastic. The establishment of a female monastic tradition in China would take several centuries after the Han period, but the specific theological position of Buddhism on women's spiritual capacity, that women could achieve enlightenment, that women could take the monastic vows, was a position that would eventually have significant implications for Chinese women's religious lives. The fall of Han and what the women carried through at the Han Dynasty's end, the long decline of the 2nd century CE and the fragmentation of the empire into the Three Kingdoms period in 220 CE, was a catastrophic period for Chinese civilization. The population declined dramatically, the institutional infrastructure of the empire was disrupted, and the specific achievements of the Han period, the Silk Road trade, the Confucian examination system, the great works of scholarship, were partially destroyed and had to be rebuilt by subsequent dynasties. Women's experience of this period of catastrophic disruption has left relatively little documentary record, which is typical. The chaos of a civilization's collapse does not produce the administrative documentation that preserves daily life in stable periods. What the historical record does preserve is the literary response to the period, including some of the most remarkable women's literature in Chinese history. Cai Wenji, a poet and musician of the late Han period, the daughter of the great scholar Cai Yong, was captured in one of the northern raids that characterized the period of chaos and taken to live among the Xiongnu. She lived among them for approximately 12 years, bearing 2 sons by the Xiongnu chieftain she was given to. She was eventually ransomed and returned to China by the warlord Cao Cao, who valued her father's scholarship and wanted her literary knowledge preserved. The poems attributed to Cai Wenji, particularly the Beifeng Shi, the poems of grief and resentment, and the Hujia Shiba Pai, the 18 songs of the nomad flute, are among the most emotionally powerful literary works of the Chinese tradition, expressing the grief of the captive, the longing for home, and the specific pain of leaving her children behind when she was ransomed. Whether the poems are genuinely by Cai Wenji or are later compositions attributed to her name is a scholarly question that has not been definitively resolved. What is clear is that the tradition found in her story, the learned woman torn between 2 worlds, the mother separated from her children, the survivor of captivity trying to rebuild a life in a civilization changed beyond recognition, a story worth commemorating in poetry of genuine quality. The women who maintained the Han scholarly tradition through the period of fragmentation, who preserved the texts, who transmitted the knowledge of the classical tradition to the next generation, who maintained the institutional life of learning in the households and the communities that survived the political chaos, are mostly unnamed in the historical record. But the Han tradition was preserved, and the preservation required human labor, and the human labor of cultural transmission has always been partly women's work. Ban Zhao's Nüjie survived. The Han Shu survived. The work she completed is one of the texts that the subsequent tradition preserved with the greatest care. because it was one of the 4 great official histories and therefore one of the foundational documents of the Chinese historical tradition. Her scholarly work, buried in the institutional records of the Han court, survived in the specific way that institutional knowledge survives, in the texts that the court and the scholarly community valued enough to copy and preserve. What the Yellow River remembered, the Han women's long afterlife. It is very late now. The Yellow River is dark, the great river that is the cradle of Chinese civilization, that deposits the yellow soil that gives it its name and colors the sea at its mouth, that has been flooding and silting and supporting the agricultural civilization of northern China for 10,000 years, is dark in the specific way that rivers are dark at this hour, moving in the darkness without anyone watching it move. The silk is still being made. The specific technique of silk production that the Han Dynasty's women perfected, the raising of silkworms on mulberry leaves, the reeling of the cocoons, the weaving of the thread into the specific luxury textiles that the world valued, is still practiced in China, in a mechanized and industrialized form that would be unrecognizable to the Han women who managed the process in their households and workshops, but continuous with what they created. The silk that comes from China today is a direct descendant of the silk that the Han Empire's women made. Ban Zhao's Nüjie was last reprinted as a guide to women's conduct approximately in the 20th century, when the specific Confucian tradition it represented was explicitly rejected by the intellectual and political movements that transformed China. The 2,000 years of its influence, the classrooms and the households where Chinese women were educated in its prescriptions, ended in the 20th century, not with a scholarly revision but with a political revolution that rejected the entire tradition the text represented. Whether this represents justice for the women whose lives the text constrained, or whether it represents the destruction of something that also contained, alongside the constraints, real knowledge about how to navigate a world that was not going to change on the schedule that anyone hoped, is a question that does not have a simple answer. Empress Lü Zhi's name appears in every account of the Han Dynasty's founding. The specific horror of what she did to Lady Qi is documented in the Shiji and retold in the Han Shu and discussed in every subsequent commentary on the early Han period. The effectiveness of her governance is acknowledged in the same sources that document the horror. The tradition has not found a way to resolve this, and there is probably no resolution available, just the specific human reality of a woman who was capable of extraordinary cruelty and extraordinary governance simultaneously, which the historical record preserves without comfort. The Silk Road is gone in the specific form that the Han Dynasty created and maintained. The specific political and military infrastructure that made the Han Silk Road possible, the network of military garrisons along the western routes, the diplomatic relationships with the Oasis kingdoms, the specific commercial arrangements that moved Chinese silk westward and Western goods and technologies eastward, dissolved with the Han Dynasty. What remained was the knowledge of the routes, the established commercial relationships, the specific cross-cultural contacts that the Han Silk Road had created, which were rebuilt in different forms by the successor civilizations. The women who had been part of it, the weavers who made the silk, the merchants' wives who traveled the routes, the oasis women who managed the hospitality industry, are mostly absent from the history of the road, but the road that exists in the historical record was built partly on their labor. The Yellow River is moving in the darkness. The mulberry trees are bare in the winter, the silkworms dormant in their cocoons. In the spring the leaves will come back and the silkworms will hatch and the women who raise them will begin the cycle that has been running for 4,000 years. The silk will be made. Sleep well. Good night.